not eating that Kit Kat. Oh. Welcome to Monstrosities Mon Amour, where we love the things you hate, unless you love them too, in which case we love the things you also love, which lacks tension. I'm John Grindrod, a writer who gets all misty-eyed at a bollard. Today, I was just putting the bins out when I was bundled into the boot of an Austin maxi by writer Gareth E Rees, author of Car Park Life and Unofficial Britain. Think Notes from a Small Island, rewritten by the League of Gentlemen. He drove us, I'd say, approximately 202.8 kilometres from Milton Keynes, give or take. There was a bag of clothing in the boot, don't know what that's all about. Well, thanks for letting me out, Gareth. I've got no idea where we are. Where have you brought me?
We're in the city of Bristol, and we're in the centre of Bristol near the areas of St Paul and Easton, where the M32 cuts brutally through the middle of the city like a sort of tarmac river. We've got lots and lots of houses on either side, but it all comes to a strange halt in this weird, what looks possibly like a kind of big Neolithic burial mound with entry chambers and foliage and something strange happening on the other side.
It is strange from the outside. You can't really tell what you're about to plunge into here. What are we about to plunge into? What's it like?
We're about to go into Junction 3 of the M32 in Bristol. It's a circular junction where the cars come up from either side and go down onto the motorway on either side. But it's also a place where pedestrians can pass through from one side onto the other side. And it sort of forms a large roundabout on top of what is described as a motorway, but it really looks like a dual carriageway because there's only two lanes on either side.
And it's really busy. There's a lot of traffic here, isn't it? This is like all of the cars that are coming off of the M4 and coming into Bristol or going the other way. That's a lot of traffic.
It's a constant flowing river of traffic. Yeah, it never stops. And I think people on either side of the motorway will get this soundtrack permanently.
When it was built, this was quite a controversial project, wasn't it? We're right in the middle of like a whole massive housing area.
Yeah, this was a bustling part of Bristol. It was full of Victorian houses. Lots of immigrant communities lived there. It was a real place. And the motorway cut right through the heartland of this city. And it was very controversial. It was in the late 60s and it effectively split the communities in two. And as it did so, the businesses on either side began to wither away. And they caused all sorts of kind of social deprivation and eventually outbreaks of violence and rioting in the 80s.
It's got an incredible emotional punch for what is a gyratory system.
It is. I would say it's a hugely problematic structure that has had a massive social and cultural effect on the places around it, which what makes it so sort of fascinating.
But interestingly, you like it. When did your love affair with Junction 3 begin?
It was about 7 years ago I started writing, maybe 6 years ago. I started writing and researching a book called Unofficial Britain. And the idea of Unofficial Britain was to look at everyday places, urban areas, infrastructural places, and sort of work out how they fit into the kind of modern folklore of place. So my theory is that eventually everything becomes storied by human contact. We spend a long enough time in places, we go through cycles of birth and death, they become storied, they become full of ghosts, they become places part of our memory, they become landmarks, they become places that remind us of loved ones and events in our lives. And, around them become these sort of folkloric stories. So I believe every place can be interesting if you look deeply enough. Anywhere that's kind of lasted long enough, whether it's a sort of a chimney or an electricity pylon or a hospital, it may be maligned and it might be seen as a carbuncle, as some kind of intrusive modern, hyper-modern object at the beginning. But after a while, it becomes what people take for granted when they grow up. It becomes part of the place that they love. And so I tested that theory by going out across Britain to places at random. The idea wasn't to find the most exceptional place, example of each structure. I wasn't trying to find the biggest or the weirdest or the most unusual. It was really all about what is there in the everyday, what are the sort of places that are near where people live that have much more magic and mystery than they might expect. So I took random cities and went and visited them. Bristol is a place I've got a big connection to because I had a university friend who was there, so I used to go and visit in my university years, and my brother lived there. I got my first job in Cardiff, and my girlfriend lived in Bristol, so I used to go to Bristol. And it seems to be a place I just come back to again and again. One of my best friends lived there. I'm in a band, and we've played a few gigs there. It always seems to be I end up in Bristol. So So I thought, well, that would be a great place to go. And I knew a couple of people there, an electronic musician called Nick, who is also known as Echoplex. He makes electronic music, and a guy called Mark Hollis, who's an artist. And he lives very, very close to this area. So I said, well, if I come and visit you, can you take me out on a walk to some local places? So this was really a random discovery. They knew I was looking for sort of urban areas. So they took me out through St. Paul's. And eventually we got to this strange wall covered in graffiti with an underpass going through it. And this was my entry into this, I call it a hidden world. It's not a secret, but it's a world that seems to sort of happen just off screen. It's impossible to see the Junction as a whole thing, unless you take some kind of aerial shot. And even then, you probably wouldn't get the whole measure of it. So if you're driving underneath it, it's just a bridge. If you're coming at it as a walk, it looks like a tunnel through a kind of great big mound of earth. And if you're inside it, it looks like a park inside a roundabout with all these kind of foliage and shrubberies and strange objects and graffiti. So this was the magical hidden world into which I entered with these two people.
And that's a sort of curious thing, that it's surprisingly green. That is not generally people's expectation or experience of using a pedestrian underpass kind of route or a sort of pedestrian access bit around a motorway is not normally how green it is. But that was a surprising aspect for you.
Yeah, it was full of daffodils and it was full of greenery. There were people lolling around like they would in a park. And you could hear the cars whistling around you because the cars stream around this place on a raised roundabout. So they're coming off the ramps from the motorway and then they're hurtling around the outside of this structure. But within it, it's this kind of strange, serene place. It's like a very sort of picturesque version of the kind of Ballard, concrete island thing, where his was a bit more kind of decayed. This feels a bit more like it's kind of coming back to life. And it's got people in it. People are using it like a place. It's not a transitory place. It's not just a going from one to another. It's a place that people will stop in. People are clearly using it. They're using it to get high. They're using it to, daub graffiti. They're using it to sit around, take a break from work, sit with their bicycles, eat a sandwich. And so it felt like a real place, not just an accidental routeway. And that was what was interesting about it, because it was sort of full of interesting objects and writings and sort of seemed slightly folkloric kind of objects. So, for example, I found a doll on the bridge looking over the motorway itself. And it was a blonde hair, very sort of old Victorian dress, roses on its lap, some daffodils, hair entwined with the structure, and it'd be left there as some kind of offering. Now, normally you think this would be for a memorial for someone who jumped maybe but it wasn't. There didn't seem to be any indication that this was a sort of memorial to someone. So I was a very curious object to find, and it suggested that people saw some kind of significance in this object.
Yeah, absolutely. And also in the place, that there's something about it that has made people link the object and the place together quite strongly. It's interesting that you mentioned J.G. Ballard there and Concrete Island. That is a novel that a lot of people will know, written in the early 70s as part of his concrete phase. High Rise is after that, and the Atrocity Exhibition is just before that, and Crash. So there's a period of him writing these very intense urban dystopian novels. And Concrete Island is really interesting because that idea of a car goes off the motorway and he ends up marooned in this weird landscape in the middle of a junction, which was sort of curiously sort of also a junction that was really near his house in West London, and that he finds all of this mysterious stuff there that, almost like a sort of lost civilization that's going on, a sort of lost world. But rather than dinosaurs, it's a few slightly desperate people living strange lives in this place. So you go to this concrete island, and it doesn't sound like that in terms of a dystopia. It sounds like people are choosing to be there, actually, in some instances, and that it's not just somewhere that people are passing through. Some people are sort of staying, but not because they're trapped.
Yeah, people are choosing to be there. It's a strange oasis, and it's unlike Ballards, which you get the sense of it being sunken with the motorways around it. It's in an elevated position, so the motorway flows sort of through and beneath, which is a really strange thing. But then you've got the cars around it, which creates this kind of very interesting sonic environment, which some people would find aggressive. But then within it, there's a sense of calm. It's a bit like being in the eye of a hurricane. So it feels like there are two parallel timescapes going on. You've got this hustle and bustle of the urban life, and then in the middle of it, you've got this pause, this complete stop, this sort of place where time flows differently, and you get a real sense of that. And that's where I think people tend to stop, why people tend to stop there and kind of contemplate. And it seems to be because it's a hidden place and it's sort of off the beaten track, I think within this sort of area, people then feel the need to express themselves. It's not just that people just stop to sort of smell the flowers. It feels like they stop and then they feel like they need to somehow engage with this object in a kind of intellectual way or a political way.
You talk about the ghosts of places being kind of imprinted on them. And this is very much a place where people's presence, the ghosts of their interactions with it, have remained for years, and they're part of the place now, that people have imprinted themselves on the actual structure itself. What sort of stuff is it that the people are doing?
So, I mean, it must be interesting for someone who's lived there for a long time, because I think probably your perspective on this object and this place will be dependent on where you come from in Bristol and what kind of community you've been in. At one point, probably the only people who'd have gone there would have been people in gangs and people using it to get high. It would have been a no-go area for other people. There'd have been people in the more gentrified age now who go passing through it with their bicycles on the way to work. So I guess everyone has a different perspective on it. But what you can see as the kind of visible remnants of it are this sort of palimpsest of graffiti and sloganeering that are sort of layered onto the walls. It's a kind of ever-evolving canvas where people are putting all sorts of political slogans up. There are weird references to kind of obscure writers, almost like book recommendations. People tell you what books to read, save the NHS. There are little poems stapled up. So one of the things I found was, which again seems to be an ongoing sort of communal project, unofficial communal project, is this. It's a shrine. It's like a sort of metal bin with a little sort of scooped holder for what was originally, I think, in it was seeds or something like that, maybe a bird feeder. It had an Extinction Rebellion sign on it when I went. But then as I went back a second time, a couple of years later, it had been repainted and there seems to be more additional stuff going on. So it feels like whoever put that there first may have had it for one reason, and people have then appropriated it and turned it into something else. And it seems to be an ongoing art project. I don't think anyone's officially in charge of the shrine. The shrine has just sort of taken on its own life and people feel the need to add to it. I've seen offerings inside it, and then people sort of put their promotional stickers on it, which you see. But then also seems to be very deliberate references to climate change and ecological collapse in this place. And bearing in mind, this is a very petroleum-heavy structure that is, it feels like people are, whilst it's a problematic structure, it feels like something where we're having an honest discussion for once about what these things mean in our society. This is a structure that brought pollution and kind of carnage to the places around it, sort of, noise pollution as well as kind of petroleum pollution. But then you've also got around the structure other kind of arguments going on. For example, there's lots of trees that protect the local residents from the effects of it, but these are being threatened to be cut down by the council. So now there are people kind of living in the trees. So when I last went there, there's sort of campsites and things in there. So it's an ongoing battleground, and it feels like it's really about the society we live in. I think you can find out a lot about contemporary Britain and contemporary Western culture by going to an object like this and seeing what's happening with it.
Yeah, and also seeing how people reclaim spaces that maybe weren't intended for the use that they're putting them to. I always think that's really interesting, that people, when confronted with a huge structure like that, which has sort of been imposed on the landscape, can then come into it and produce something much more intimate and much more meaningful on an individual level to a place that otherwise would feel as if it had no mark of an individual human on it. It's sort of pre-computer, but it's moulded as if it is a sort of CGI object, really.
I saw this in unofficial Britain wherever I went, wherever there was a flyover or an underpass, motorway bridge. It was always like this blank canvas for poetry, for art, for politics, for promotions of bands. It's a place for illicit clubbing, people taking their stereos down there. It's full of life, and that's what's so magical about it. It's almost like we've colonized it, and it's not allowed to be this thing that destroys the community. If it's going to be there, then people are going to sort of take it over and reappropriate it. It was what really started me on my writing journey, because what it reminds me of is how the marshland of London, the sort of the Lower Lee Valley, Hackney Marsh area was for me. So that was a place that was a post-industrial area. It was really just used for barges and bringing sort of goods up into London. And again, it was a no-go area. And then it's just been completely transformed by the communities of Walthamstow and Hackney around it into this place. It's this vibrant like park, and it's just full of people and full of sort of events and sort of excitement. And I feel like that's the same that's happening in a sort of small way with little structures like this, little pockets around cities where people are refusing to sort of take the instructive sort of dialogue of capitalism, that this is just a functional place and you must use it as we decide. They say, no, we're going to use it however we like because we live here. And this is going to be our place.
And if you kind of look at the construction of somewhere like this, which kind of does physically divide an area that had been very connected, it feels like an apocalypse has sort of happened to that community when it is built. And then I guess, those dystopian, Ballardian sort of early 70s responses are very much looking at places like this as a dystopian landscape and as a apocalypse. But the way that people are responding to them now feels very post-apocalyptic. Like people are now sort of rebuilding a sort of society sort of through and around it that maybe was hard to envisage at the time, but has shown a sort of the fact that these places now have existed for 50, 60 years. They're not new anymore. They're, the shock of them has sort of dissipated and something else is there now. And that something else is all of the memories of all the people that pass through that every day. It might be people that actually have to go through it because it's the only way they can get across from one side to the other on their route. But also people that sort of choose to go there as well. People aren't people aren't always going to be funneled that way, but some people are going to deliberately go out of their way to have that as part of their journey.
When new generations grow up with it being the fact of things, the reality of things, you just accept that it's there. There's no question of it before. When you grew up as a kid, I grew up up in Glossop in Derbyshire, and there was this huge chimney in the middle of the town that was absolutely hated by the community. And it had only been put up in 1977, and I moved there in 1980, and I just assumed it had always been there. For me, it was an ancient structure, and it was the most exciting thing because it looked like a space rocket. And so I had a very, very different view to the people who lived there. So the same thing with this kind of structure. If this is where you grow up, this is actually a place that's kind of got of interest to you. It might be the place where you meet your friends. It might be the place that it's got that landmark quality to it. So it just becomes your everyday reality. I guess the baseline reality shifts. We talk about this in climate change, the idea of the baseline reality, what we accept as normal shifts. In a way it does with this, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because at the very least people are it starts to grow. People start to grow their stories on it, and it also begins to physically grow with vegetation. And in a way, what we should be thinking about is more of these structures being more like this. We should have these motorway structures, and infrastructure should be covered in plants and leaves. And that should go for whatever the structure is. This is really where the future lies. In a way, that this is a kind of pioneering structure.
So you talked about the doll, but that's not the only strange, slightly mythic figure that you found there, is it?
There was also the standing stone. One of the interesting things about the structure, when you look at it and you sort of forget about the motorways, it really does look like a kind of Neolithic structure. It has a lot of the hallmarks of that. There's a guy called Kenny Brophy who, up in Glasgow University, who is called the urban prehistorian, who looks at the ways that the Neolithic exists in the kind of the contemporary infrastructures, and how they kind of hark back to that, and how sometimes that they overlay or have similar kind of functions and structures. And this one does feel like sort of one of these sort of tunnel type chambers, where you have the entrances and things. And interestingly, the last time I went, there was also a standing stone there. So just outside one of the entrances is a proper standing stone, sort of embedded in a little plinth in an area, which kind of made me think about, was this a sort of deliberate conversation with the structure? Are we sort of going full tilt now, and we're going to say it is kind of functioning like a sort of central meeting point, ceremonial place? But then a woman came out and sort of complained to me about it. So she saw me looking at the standing stone and said, that's just there because they don't want me to park my car there anymore. So there were these kind of like sort of rough areas right next to the junction where people were sort of put in their cars. Like I say, it's an interesting junction because mostly often these things are very separate from the from the residential area. But this one's right there. The houses go right up to the junction. So people are living right next to it. And obviously people are parking. Like any city, there's people struggling over parking. So it feels like what they've done is they've come up with a sort of solution, which is to create a sort of standing stone that stops people from parking. At the same time, she also had a small vacuum cleaner that she wanted me to fix for some reason, a handheld dust buster. And if you give me any mechanical object, I just go into a blind panic. Anything, I can't fix anything. I used to never be able to put the children's car seats in the car. Blind panic, anything with mechanisms. And so I couldn't fix it. So she just sort of tutted at me and walked away. But that's the kind of strange interactions you might get in this place if you wander around and start taking notice of them. And that's why it does feel like a place. Someone might walk out in some slippers and a dressing gown with a dustbuster, and it's also a motorway junction, and that's something maybe you don't get in most of them.
I like the idea of this standing stone, this sort of megalith, but it's suspended in the air, really. It's not actually embedded in the ground. A bit like they're talking about tunnelling under Stonehenge.
It's a very circular structure. If anyone's listening to this and wants to look at it, if you just sort of Google it and look down upon it on a map, it's this incredible sort of disc-like shape. It's got a strange beauty to it. It's a bit like Spaghetti Junction. It's got these incredible curves and things. But something about these sort of circular structures feel like they have these primal echoes in humans that make us want to put standing stones in them. So the proliferation of standing stones on roundabouts, for example, that is one of the other chapters of the Unofficial Britain book I was looking at, was the idea of roundabouts and ring roads, and how they also seem to have sort of ceremonial resonances beyond just their function, or that because of the circular nature, maybe something to do with that shape inspires something in the human mind. I think it's a very interesting idea about the geometry of things. Seems to have a kind of folkloric or cultural resonance. Whether that's deliberate or not, I don't know. So, you've got your standing stone, you've got the doll, you've got, I also found quite a lot of references to magic mushrooms painted on the wall, this sort of psychedelic thing. I had this idea that if someone, like in thousands of years' time and our society's ruined, came to this particular point, they would see this kind of concrete causeway going through what seemed like a populated area with this circular burial mound full of fragments of seeds, magic mushrooms, and would say this was clearly a place for, ritual and psychedelic experiences, maybe transportation to the next realm or something. These tunnels probably represented the underworld or something like that. You can see the kind of that archaeological overlay. I mean, kind of in a way, that's all people are doing with Stonehenge. So I don't think anyone is any the wiser with that either. The idea of Stonehenge might have had a functional quality to it, but we've just assumed it was ceremonial. Maybe this would be the same when we look at our motorways, which form these incredible structures of ley lines through important power centres across the landscape. And when it's all kind of turned to rubble and it's just a few low walls and little bits of fragments, I'd be interested to see how people would interpret it.
See, that's a whole other Ballard novel waiting there. One of his ruin lust novels, isn't it?
What was interesting is the subjective nature of these things. So one of the things I'm always important to stress is I did a book about car parks and supermarket car parks. And I was always important to stress that just because I say this about it, this is not somehow the truth about car parks, because it's a completely subjective experience. And everyone will have a different view on it. But also not only that, but a place isn't the same each time you visit it. There's this sort of phenomenological aspect of it. So when I approached it with Nick and Mark, this time it had a certain look to it. It was a certain season, and there were certain objects that I found in that time. When I went back to it a couple of years ago with a Bristol journalist who wanted to do an article about it, I revisited the very, very same structure, and it found a whole load of different stuff. It felt completely different. It was a whole new, rich kind of source of graffiti. That's where I discovered the standing stone. That's where I started to read some of the other bits of graffiti that I hadn't seen before. That's where I met the woman with the dustbuster and got a different sense of it. And I feel like these places are constantly changing. So really, it's about you interacting with places at the moment. That's where all the excitement and the magic comes from. So the place itself is one aspect for it. There's no real one story to it. And I think you can go it multiple times and there's this rich stuff that just comes out of it. So I feel like it's one of these, what I call a fertile place, like a place that every time I went back to it, I'd probably find out something more about it and about myself. That's the key to an exciting place for me.
So when I was in the boot of the car, there was, as I say, a bag. I opened it up and it was full of cardigans. Why so many cardigans?
I'm a lover of cardigans. While I am a man who's now in his early 50s with children and probably peak cardigan wearing zone, I've been wearing cardigans since I was about 18. I absolutely love them. And I'm always frustrated by the fact that there was a period when I was young where I used to go in Covent Garden to a shop called Pop, which did lots of 1970s clothes. And they had these amazing, like, thin sort of cardigans you could put over a shirt and wear, kind of that kind of thing. And they just seem to have vanished from the landscape. I can't find them anywhere. All you get is chunky cardigans, these kind of chunky knit cardigans, or as my kids call them, a daddigan. And I can't find them for love nor money. I've since discovered, apparently, that the place to get these specific kind of cardigans that clearly no one wants to buy is on Vinted. So this is an app that I've never used before and fills me with some kind of horror. But it might be that I have to resort to Vinted in order to find this artifact. There seems to be a clothing artifact that no one wants to sell, and it's very hard to find in the shops. I want to reclaim them. They're not just sort of the fusty old Werther's original granddad from the advert thing. I think they've got more to them than that.
Yeah, because there is a sort of strange thing, isn't there, that they're synonymous with the mod revival, and then your 80s indie kid will be wearing a cardigan with, a Smiths T-shirt underneath. But then also it's your sitcom dad. outfit as well, isn't it? That kind of thin cardie is also the sort of thing that Eric Sykes would wear while reading the paper and complaining about the neighbours. Yeah. And it is a kind of curious item of clothing because it feels like it's been appropriated by loads of very different people in different eras in the sort of late 20th century particularly. It ends up meaning lots of different things, but a lot of those meanings have just disappeared. And as you say, it's just been replaced by one, I think, sort of category error meaning of, as you say, sort of Werther's original granddad, which is not really my relationship with the thin cardie, which I also love. I love a thin cardie, and I'm so gutted. I've knackered all of mine. They've all got holes in, and I had to get rid of most of them. And I was so gutted when that happened, because as you say, you don't see them very often.
I don't understand it. And you're right, you could be Richard Briers or you could be Kurt Cobain, I think, in a cardigan. I like a bit of mod wear myself, and even the mod online shops I get stuff from aren't rich in cardigans. And again, I don't know whether it's a demand problem, but I feel like there needs to be some kind of cardigan revival.
I'm slightly annoyed that the zipper hoodie and the zip top has replaced the cardigan, because I don't want to wear some fleecy thing. I want to wear something that makes me look like I've just stumbled out of a slip-on shoe advert in 1978. That's what I want to look like.
No, there's no place for hoods and cardigans and no place for zippers and cardigans. You know, it needs buttons.
There's a real kind of crossover here between the two things that you've been talking about. That idea of the ghosts of previous owners of the cardigans and the ghosts of the kind of previous users of the interchange. There's a real sense of connecting to the modernity of a different era there. You know, they're both these late 20th century hyper-modern things, and yet at the same time, they're really old now. They're no longer these kind of new, shiny things, to the point where the cardigans of that era have sort of vanished. And the interchange now represents something different to people. People have reclaimed it in a different way. There's something very interesting about that spirit, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about those sort of super modern post-war structures being, 70 years old, 75 years old, these are like Victorian structures would have been to us when we were born in the early 70s. And we didn't think anything about those being haunted. Railway stations, Victorian houses, these seemed very haunted, but we'd expect to see ghosts in them. And I think now we'd expect to see the inhabitants of these flyovers and motorway service stations and hospital buildings and stuff. In a way, they're just as old and they're just as ghosted. I think the Ballardian view of them as a super modern structure was really important at the time. In a way, though, we're post that now. And they are now crumbling edifices. In fact, I think there's something a bit like the cardigan. It's something quaint about it. I was writing about this in Car Park Life. If you look at something like a Morrison's car park, it's full of hedgerows. It's got trolley staff who will move things around. It's got trolley bays. There seems to be lots of kind of areas to sit in. Skateboarders use it at night. But then if you look at the new breed of kind of budget supermarket car parks, so the Aldi and Lidl, there's just nothing there. And it's almost impossible to get in there. There's no loitering. It's just a very dangerous place, very packed into very small areas. And I had this idea that maybe people might look back with kind of sentimental fondness for the kind of the Morrisons and the Asda car parks of the time. Something again that was seen as an abhorrent kind of structure, this sort of supermarket car park, a non-place, an absolute identikit thing. In a way, a lot of people could maybe hark back and think, well, I remember when they were like this. Remember we used to hang out. Remember I had my first joint there. Remember when we used to meet in the car park. So I feel like that happens with everything, whether it's a cardigan, a supermarket car park thing. It takes a little bit of time, but once I think a few generations have been through it, it becomes a kind of this incredibly haunting, evocative, emotional object or entity or place that has as much resonance as an eerie abandoned mill or a Victorian structure that we assume would be haunted now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for sharing your lovely haunted memories of cardigans and places. I've really enjoyed it. People can find out more about you online, can't they, via your site? They can
Google Gareth E Rees, that will avoid all the rugby players and get to me. And they can look at unofficialbritain.com, which is still online. It's not active, but you can find all my details and lots of old bits and pieces there. And my books are on most websites that you'd expect.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much for sharing those with me. And I'm now off to go and haunt my favourite old cardigan, which is now held together by safety pins in a slightly inappropriate punk wear.